This is a special presentation from CBS 5 Eyewitness News.
When this trip down Market Street was filmed precisely a century ago, these San Franciscans had no clue that within 7 months, they would be throttled by the greatest earthquake ever to strike a major American city. And when this was videotaped precisely a century later, many people had forgotten that it had ever happened.
Do you know what happened on April 18th, 1906?
No.
Short memory and no information.
It would incinerate 520 square blocks in the city. It would rip through roads in the Santa Cruz Mountains, tear through the hills of North Marin, and vanish without a trace at a place near Olima.
This is that place, photographed 100 years ago. That impressive crack is gone.
In a summer that saw what will probably be the costliest natural disaster in U.S. history, this reminder.
The one thing that will look a lot like Louisiana, Mississippi will be a major Bay Area earthquake.
I don't worry about it too much.
No, we're not really worried, no.
And where time hasn't buried the 1906 rupture,
the fault goes right on the left side of that.
People have.
It's very difficult to find the fault in this area. It's basically been plowed over and covered with houses.
If we know that the San Andreas ripped through here in 1906, how would you look for the rupture in the same place today?
Well, I'll tell you, what it looks like now is that.
Know exactly where that is.
For 10 years, scientists have been working on finding the 1906 rip.
You're walking right on it.
In the next 30 minutes, the fracture that went underground a century ago will be brought to light again.
Is it possible that we could get another big quake on the San Andreas within a decade?
Oh, absolutely.
I'm science correspondent Brian Hackney. Tonight, we'll all but reopen the fracture that split the Earth's crust more than a century ago as CBS 5 joins the world's top San Andreas geologists in finding the fault on the trail of the 1906 earthquake.
If you asked me, where can I hide a magnitude 7 earthquake to do the least amount of damage in the Bay Area, I promise you I would have chosen the Santa Cruz Mountains. It is the place with the lowest population density anywhere around the Bay.
At 60, 70 miles away.
Serious damage on the Bay Bridge.
It was not what I would call a real Bay Area earthquake.
I don't know how the hell we're going to get him out.
In fact, the shaking even that knocked down the 880 freeway was not that high. And in that sense, we're not tested at all by it.
Now put it 5 miles away, and it's a different event altogether. There's no comparison.
Go home, people!
Loma Prieta, 6,300 buildings damaged or destroyed. The cost, $7 billion, 62 dead. And it didn't really count.
We have not, in the Bay Area proper, we have not had a really serious earthquake since 1906.
It has the potential to be the largest financial disaster to strike the country.
And when it does, it'll be the most natural thing in the world. From where it steps out of the Salton Sea in the southern desert to where it plunges offshore near Cape Mendocino, the San Andreas Fault spans 750 miles. In a general way, it divides the Pacific Plate to the west from the American Plate to the east, with just a thin veneer of crust bridging the gap. The Pacific Plate grinds northwest about 2 inches a year relative to the North American Plate. Stress has been increasing on Bay Area faults ever since it was released dramatically back in 1906. For 20 million years, everything to the west of the fault system has been on the move like this. Los Angeles, San Juan Bautista, San Francisco, all of it has been moved north about 350 miles. All it took was about 175,000 great quakes. Each of them the size of 1906. Each of them buried by wind, by water, by time.
This is all that's left of the 1906 rupture.
Now, two scientists are trying to find it again.
Hello, Carol. How are you?
Carol Prentice, Caltech PhD, USGS geologist.
Oh boy, these are beautiful.
That's Tim Hall, Cal graduate, Stanford PhD, and what sounds like a simple plan.
Let's make a map of the San Andreas Fault here on the San Francisco Peninsula.
But it has taken 10 years to put the San Andreas Fault in its place.
Where did that one go?
They can identify the rupture easily in 1906 pictures.
This little boy is standing on a clump of dirt here, and that's the clump of dirt right there.
But where the San Andreas ripped back then looks like this now.
The development changed the details of the landscape to the point where it's actually really hard to just say, here's the fault right here.
You can see this little, see that ridge.
So they went back to pictures taken before the bay was developed.
I know exactly where that is. I know exactly where that is.
They can find the fault easily on 1946 aerial photographs.
And here it comes down, it just clips the shoreline.
They can superimpose where the fault was then to where it still has to be now.
There we go. There's, isn't that wild?
In some places, I think we can really put our finger on it. I'd say we know within a few meters of where it broke in 1906.
For the first time since the years following 1906, we can follow the precise trace where the rupture ripped to the surface, despite every attempt to bury it.
Oh, that's beautiful. We are right on top of the fault.
When you see where the fault lies now, you'll know why we haven't seen anything yet. A century ago, they knew the San Andreas Fault existed. Geologist Andrew Lawson may have named it after himself when he dubbed it the San Andreas in 1895. But they could not have known that 200 years' worth of stress had accumulated miles below the trolley lines on Market Street, that something had to give. It was just past 5:12 a.m., April 18th, 1906. It exploded with the energy of 2,500 nuclear bombs. The epicenter was out here, some miles off the Golden Gate, 6 miles beneath the Pacific. From the epicenter, the rupture spread simultaneously north and south. To the north, it disappeared off the coast at Shelter Cove. To the south, the fault ruptured for 100 miles, recording the last gasp of the rupture from the 1906 quake here in San Juan Bautista. That's it down below, the driveway into Nyland Ranch. That bend in the fence lining the driveway is about as far south as the rupture made it in 1906.
Are we ready to go and fly the beauty?
On the trail of the rupture now with Dr. Tim Hall as our guide, and do we need him? Because while the rupture clearly headed northwest from the mission in San Juan into the Santa Cruz Mountains, the Stanford student assigned to hunt it down back then never found it.
It's topographically challenging, it's densely vegetated.
He didn't even have a map.
We do know this railroad bridge was yanked 3.5 feet to the northwest near Watsonville and over the crest of the Santa Cruz Mountains, just beyond the epicenter of the 1989 quake. Loma Prieta was only 3% as powerful as 1906. 100 years ago, it triggered this landslide 7 miles west of Palo Alto, shaking the mud off the face of the fault itself. This is the actual San Andreas?
This is the actual San Andreas. This is one of the few places in Northern California that I'm aware of where you can put your finger on part of the San Andreas.
It's not easy to get to.
This is precisely where the Pacific and North American plates meet.
This is moving north in sudden and dramatic lurches during big quakes.
That's correct.
They never found the surface rupture in the Loma Prieta quake either. But the 1906 epicenter was recovered where it emerged from the Santa Cruz Mountains, 5 miles west of Palo Alto, ripping fences.
Oh my God, is that the offset?
That's the offset.
And that's right where the break was?
That's where the break, that's it.
And now that break is about what, 4 feet?
That's about 4 feet, 3 to 4 feet here.
So we're looking straight down the San Andreas.
You are standing on the San Andreas right now.
Boy, if it were to go right now, we'd get some good video.
You would be spun around.
Down below, the fault ripped and split everything in its path, including Alpine Road, offset and sunk in an instant a century ago.
And this is what Alpine Road, in the exact location, looks like today.
5 miles east of the fault, Stanford is badly damaged. University President David Starr Jordan says in the future, all buildings here will be earthquake-proof. 83 years later, in 1989, Stanford takes a $160 million hit from Loma Prieta. The university has no earthquake insurance. But at least in '89, Professor Agassi was not knocked off of his pedestal.
The fault is underneath these large redwood trees. We're right over downtown Portola Valley.
The San Andreas steps out of the Santa Cruz Mountains just south of Portola Valley and plows on to the northwest. It skims those buildings to the right, a retirement complex just off the fault.
Going right over Woodside.
Trouble could be brewing here on the southern segment of the San Andreas. It wouldn't be the first time.
We know that it produced a large earthquake in 1838. We know it produced a 7 in 1989. The notion that we could have, let's say, a 7 on the peninsula part of the San Andreas at any time is legitimate.
Now pushing north out of Woodside, the fault parallels 280 to the east and dives into Upper Crystal Springs.
There you go. There's the big escarpment. You got it centered beautifully right on the picture.
Engineers couldn't resist the notch carved by the San Andreas into the peninsula. It's where they stuck the city's water supply. And right in the middle of Crystal Springs, the fault famously crosses Highway 92. It actually splits the causeway. Here's how it looks from above. The fault slices the roadbed on the eastern edge. In 1906, it bent the road, pushing the west side 7 feet closer to Alaska. It's been realigned since. On the other hand, the traffic problem will never be straightened out.
Coming right in on it. That's great.
The 1906 rupture sliced right through San Andreas Dam. It didn't lose a drop of water, even though the offset here was approaching 9 feet.
You can imagine what that would do if your house were located on the fault. A shift of 9 feet would be catastrophic.
It's the sort of danger people face as the San Andreas steps out of the water, crosses Skyline Boulevard, and disappears. In the weeks after the 1906 quake, dozens of pictures were taken of the rupture in these open fields.
One of these trees here is one of these big chrysolopus oaks over there.
Remember that clues in the pictures give clues to where the fault is buried.
And in some cases, like that photograph with the guy with the fence, you can actually say, oh, there was, about 2 meters of offset here.
This is that photograph. This man's arms are bridging the gap made in a fence ripped 8 feet apart by the 1906 quake. The fault obviously runs right where the fence broke in that empty pasture, which isn't at all empty anymore. I'm standing in the precise spot that man was standing in 100 years ago. The pasture has disappeared. The only thing that hasn't changed is that underneath it all, still, is the San Andreas fault.
There are a number of houses in that subdivision that, are going to be right on the fault that will be torn asunder. There's no doubt about that.
But when the San Andreas fault heads northwest, past the intersection of Westboro and Callan, through the open field below where pictures record the rupture from 1906 and video records the scene today with buildings nearby.
If it doesn't go through them, it goes very close to them.
As it approaches the Pacific Ocean,
Big landslides up at the top of the cliff.
the San Andreas Fault makes the unkindest cut of all in Daly City.
This is where the fault comes out to sea.
You're locating your houses on materials that are going to get a bad case of gravity.
I just want to know how long my house is going to stay here.
Well, that's a good question. That's a tough question to answer.
Houses near this Daly City neighborhood were no sooner put up in the 60s than they began falling down in the 70s. This is the last one standing at the end of Westline Drive.
A few years ago, the house that was next to you was removed, and you're on the edge of a landslide.
How many years?
100? It's very hard
50?
Very hard to tell, because there's one factor that's important, and that's you're very close to the San Andreas Fault. Many of those houses out in that area I don't think should have been built. I was there during the time when construction was in progress. Now they're gone, the backyard's gone, the houses are gone, and the people across the street have the view.
My husband said, so what? The whole world is sinking.
The problem is the soil is weak, the cliffs are 700 feet high, and they're sliced by the San Andreas.
What is going to happen during the next big quake to those cliffs?
I imagine very similar to what happened to them in 1906, which means many houses will be down the hill.
But my husband said, where are we going to find this view like this?
Your view of the ocean is wonderful,
Yeah.
and unfortunately it may get a little better.
Yeah.
You may get a little closer to it.
But what are the odds of that? What are the odds that another major quake breaks loose on the San Andreas Fault? A clue to the answer lies on the part of the fault that broke here in Marin County in 1906. We'll be on the trail of that after a different kind of break. On the morning of the 1906 quake, most of the fault ruptured to the north. When it climbed out of the ocean, it sliced the tip of Stinson Beach, knocked around a few houses at Bolinas, and the rupture roared out of the lagoon at 100 miles a minute, the rupture getting bigger as it headed northwest. The ground opened below like a zipper along the fault at Strain Ranch, and the old farmhouse had a grandstand seat when this fence was ripped apart 13 feet. 100 years later, the house is still on the hill. It hasn't moved. Neither has the San Andreas Fault. But the evidence for when the fault moved in the past and for when it might snap again in the future is just to the north.
This is the best story in Northern California right here. Dr. Nemi, I presume?
A team of geologists have dug into the fault in West Marin.
God, looks good. This might be the Rosetta Trench for the northern San Andreas.
They can actually decipher evidence for 1906-sized quakes. Each quake leaves this characteristic V shape, and they found plenty.
There have been 10 earthquakes identified within the last approximately 2,500 years.
So, 10 quakes, 2,500 years. That'd be one big quake every 250 years if it happens like clockwork.
It does not happen like clockwork.
Well, what appears to be the maximum time between big earthquakes?
On the order of maybe 300 to 400 years between big earthquakes is what that area records.
At the upper end?
At the upper end.
And what's the minimum time between big quakes?
About 100 years, maybe a little bit more, 125 years, something on that order.
So Tim, it is at least theoretically possible that there could be another magnitude 7 plus on the same part of the fault that broke in 1906.
From what we know now, that's a distinct possibility, yes. I'm standing exactly where the man in the picture was standing, and right in front of me is where it ripped in 1906.
No one knows exactly why the size of the rip increased as it headed north.
Here at Point Reyes National Seashore, the displacement was 16 feet.
That 16-foot shift happened in a millisecond.
I imagine if I were right here on this hillside, at the arrival of the first waves, instead of being nearly vertical, I would be largely horizontal.
And careful, I got you. 270 miles of the fault broke suddenly and dramatically that day. It subsided quietly and melted slowly into the background.
In this area, the fault shifted between 16 and 21 feet.
No wonder that with the 1906 rip now completely out of sight.
This is all that's left of the 1906 rupture. Time has almost erased its presence from the landscape.
It's almost completely out of mind.
Do you worry about earthquakes?
I don't worry about it too much.
No.
Of course we worry about another earthquake on the San Andreas.
We've had 100 years of strain accumulate along the San Andreas, the northern San Andreas fault.
So we need to be prepared for a 7 at least on the entire San Andreas system from Hollister all the way up to Cape Mendocino.
That could happen perhaps at any time.
In September 1905, they could not have known that they were just around the corner from being throttled by the most damaging quake in American history. By September 2005, we had learned a lot. Except when, exactly, we turned that corner again. Despite 1906, despite Loma Prieta, despite the fact it's all winding up again, there is good news.
Any quake that's produced in the Bay Area is survivable. If you do not live in an unreinforced masonry building, if you do not work in an unreinforced masonry building, and it's your job and everyone's job to know the answer to those two questions, then your chances of survival are extremely high.
Rothstein is right, but picking up a copy of this will make things a lot less painful. Putting down roots in earthquake country will be in the San Francisco Chronicle on Sunday, September 18th. A lot of good information about earthquakes here. And on CBS 5, in the centennial year of the 1906 earthquake ahead, we'll be covering all things seismic. For now, I'm science reporter Brian Hackney. Thank you for watching. For people who say, all right, so it could be tomorrow, it could also be 100 years from now, what's to worry? Why worry about it?
I would say the time to be prepared is now. Don't be in a state of perpetual denial. We know where the fault is. We know that it has generated lots of significant earthquakes in the past. Just because we're here doesn't mean it's going to be quiet.
It's not going to happen to me. I've been lucky so far. The earthquake will happen maybe 50 years from now, we'll be okay. No, the earthquake can happen tomorrow, the building will collapse.
There is some kind of reaction people have about earthquakes, and basically it can be summarized in 2 words: panic and denial. And neither of them are any good for living safely with the earthquake threat.